Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video. We're right about at 11 o'clock, ready to start the first of our online classes of the new year. Today we have wildlife benefits of a naturally untidy winter landscape by Audubon ambassador and Virginian master naturalist Tom Attenero, and we look forward to having you. And Tom, welcome, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
I'd like to thank you for all coming in and listening to this today. First thing that I want to say is that we are all gardeners. So when we're talking today, we're not talking about letting our gardens grow completely wild or returning to nature. What we're doing is we're just gardening in a different way. Garden designer Kelly D. Norris talks about something called the new naturalism. And what if the garden, Norris writes, became a place where a nearly infinite number of life cycles took place season after season? And in his book, The New Naturalism, Norris also talks about feeding the soils with the residue that our gardens already produce. And we do produce a lot. It's estimated in 2018, which are the latest figure that I could find, that there were 35 million tons of garden waste, which includes leaves and other garden debris, sent into landfills or collected. So there's definitely a lot that we can do to recycle what we have, and that's part of what this talk is about, how we can work like that. And also like to say we're gardening with a purpose. We recognize that a garden isn't just a part of our homes, but it's a place where other creatures have homes, they live, they reproduce, and they raise families. And also what we do is a legitimate style of gardening. It's just a different one from the one that we followed for so many years. And right now I'm going to give you a little bit of garden history, which bear with me, but I think it's relevant to what we do. The style that we follow became popular in England in about the mid to late 1700s, about the time of the American Revolution. That's even before I was born. And it features clumps, extensive seas of grass, clumps of trees that frame views of impressive outbuildings, water featured and offered views back to the often magnificent country house. And it was meant to show off the gardener's wealth and taste, much like the lavishly decorated interiors you'll find if you ever visit some of these houses in England, and also if you've ever watched an episode of Bridgerton. This style was revived in the United States after the end of World War II due to a number of economic, social, and cultural factors, not the least of which the millions of people who had become adults during the war came back from Europe or from other jobs, from Asia, from wherever they were, and wanted to start families. And the result was the baby boom, and that's when I was born. Now, all those families needed houses, and the economy responded with millions of new individual family homes. And those homes had these English estate-type garden yards, but on a much smaller scale. Yards with lawn in front, maybe a tree, maybe a few shrubs, usually near the foundation. And this was done for both economic and sociological reasons. First of all, it's much less expensive for a developer to bulldoze the trees and install grass, seed, and a few fast-growing woody plants. And second of all, it was also meant to, in an ironic twist, be democratic. It showed that any American could own a home with a lawn and trees in his own little estate, much the opposite of what the English were trying to do with their gardens. In 1955, a landscape architect, Thomas Church, wrote a book called Gardens Are for People that popularized the idea that gardens are an extension of a house, the garden room. And as the title suggests, this was a very people-centric book. This is some of the quotes that I took from this book. It's a place where man can show his affinity with the soil only on Saturday afternoons. Let me adjust this so I can move my own screen. It touted lawns as the ideal landscape to have. What is the substitute for a good lawn? There's nothing that can beat it, Church said. And it also treated plants in a much different way. So they're a friend of man that you can shape them to your pleasure. They don't resent when you cut them or anything like that. So they're all your fancy. Whatever you want your garden to be, you can do it that way. But then in 2007, another book came out. Many of us have read this book, Bringing Nature Home, by Doug Talmey. And this expanded the way that we look at our garden. It brought, well, nature into our homes. So instead of looked at it the opposite way, instead of nature being an extended room of our homes, we're actually bringing nature into our homes. And Talmey looked at things much different way. He said that for the first time, our role of gardeners transcends just, the purpose of making them look good. At the same time, he does recognize what Talmey said, what Church said, that the gardens do tie our homes to nature, and they are meant for our pleasure. But he's expanded that to include, including nature, not just our own pleasure. And his idea of how using plants is much different too. The use of native species to create simplified ecosystems. So that's my garden history. And I think that what the rest of what I'm going to talk about is mainly when Valerie asked me what to do, asked me what I wanted to do, and when I asked her what I should do, she said that there's a lot of information that's not really supported about what we should do with our leaves, what we should do with our stalks, our dead flower stalks, how we should manage the leaves and the stalks. And also, a lot of people have trouble with their neighbors and homeowners associations about not understanding, what this type of gardening is, or looking at it as something that's messy or not really appropriate, which is why I gave you that gardening history, because it really is appropriate. It's just a different type of gardening. In fact, even in the 1700s, there were other alternative styles of English gardening that were much more naturalistic. And this one just held sway, probably because of because it showed off the wealth. So this is a graphic that people in Audubon at home, and I know Plant Nova natives and Virginia Native Plant Society used to illustrate the importance of layers in our gardens. And this is very bird-centric. I think everything in here talks about birds and how they use these layers. But what I want to do is, hold on one second. I'm sorry. Move. It's the cat. Come on. Yeah, I bet you that's the first time that ever happened on a Zoom meeting. The cat comes in. But I'd like to sort of take a look at maybe like a less expansive look at this in one way. And this is a graphic from the University of Chicago, which also talks about layers. But these are layers at sort of a below the knee level. And this is home to things that may not be as cute as birds, and although it's still very important to birds, but it's very important to talk about how this affects the health of our gardens as gardeners, and also how it's home to other species which are very important to the ecosystem as a whole. Now, I went to research what kind of, well, first I'm going to talk about the top layer, which is basically like leaving the stalks, because this is usually when your flowers die back, and a lot we're told to make home for the bees, to some types of bees, by cutting them back. And I went to research what kind of bees actually use these stems, and the consensus seems to be that there's about 4 or 5 types of bees that use these types of things mostly for egg laying. In fact, and they're small carpenter bees, mason bees, leaf cutter bees, and yellow-faced bees. Now, each of these bees has its own nesting requirements and its own habitat requirements. And so what you do with your garden and how diverse your garden is depends on how many of these species of bees you can attract. At least it's one factor. It's not the only factor. And I found out that there's really not a whole lot of research done here. That we have a general idea that this happens, but we don't have a complete understanding of these bee life cycles, and especially the bumblebees, which I'll talk about later. So what I tried to do was to look and pull together some research on what seems to be what we might call best practices, at least according to what we know now. So the first thing is, most important thing is, before you can have the stalks, you have to have the live plant. And what to plant? Well, we're all native gardeners. We all know, or most of us are native gardeners, so we do try to stick to natives as much as we can. And these are just some of the plants that have those types of those hollow stalks or hollow pithy branches that these bees like to nest in. And smaller bees like the yellow-faced bees will go to smaller stalks like wild bergamot, monarda, and small carpenter bees, which are completely different species than the carpenter bees that usually you find drilling into your deck or something like that, tend to go for the woodier, bigger stems of the raspberry family and elderberry family. So once we have these in our garden, the question becomes, how do we make this into bee nesting site? And once again, this is where I found there's a lot of variation on exactly what to do and how to do it. And what I came up with a consensus from experts or people who write about it like Heather Holm, the Xerces Society, and also Tufts University has a pollinator initiative, which does a lot of research into bee pollination. And there are other sources too, but these are the 3 that I came up with. And they basically all agree on a regimen. And the first thing to do is that during you should cut back the new growth to leave for the bees to lay their eggs in the spring and summer. You should let that grow through the fall and winter when the bees hibernate. And then the next spring or late winter, you again cut back the stalks, the new growth, to offer nesting places for the new bees. But Tufts University came up with what they call a 3-year cycle, which their research indicated was crucial to the life cycle of the bees. And I think it helps answer some of our questions on how long should we leave these up. And I think basically the question is, you leave them up forever if you can, but that's another. Let me go through this with you. In the first year is the active growing year, when your plants are growing and the bees won't nest in the growing stems. So at the end of the growing season, usually December through March, that's when you should cut these stems back, between 6 and 18 inches. I've seen 6 and 24 inches, so that varies. But I think that 6 inches is sort of the minimum that certain types of bees need for the chambers that they put into these hollow stems. And I don't know, I guess that the taller ones serve other bees or other purposes. And by cutting back the stems, you've created the homes for next year's bees, because the bees lay eggs in these stems, and these are the bees that will hatch next year. So in year number 2, this is when the eggs that are in those stems develop. They'll develop from eggs into larvae, into adults through the winter and through the spring and summer, and emerge whenever the bees emerge. And these bees won't emerge till the next growing season. So those stalks that you just cut last December house these bees that are emerging anywhere from what I've seen, May to as late as July, depending on the type of bee. And then the winter of the second year, you do the same thing you did in the first year. All that new growth that came up during this year's growing season, you cut back, and that produces the nesting sites for the bees that have just come out. And in the third year, the stems that were produced in year 1 still have the bees, and the stems that you cut back in year 2 don't contain bees yet. So you're supposed to leave these stems standing through the entire year. And so the spring active bees will emerge by June, and fall active bees may not even emerge until August or September. So in essence, you'll have two cycles of nesting going in the garden. And the reason that they suggest is just leaving the stems up if you can, because it gets very confusing, like what stems did I cut when? So I think the easiest thing to do is if you cut back your dead stems every December from from that year's growing season, and you leave them, you'll never be cutting off the stems that may have bees nesting in them. So these dead stems. So that's a little confusing, but I think that it's doable. It's something that we can figure out. And like I say, if you can, the best thing to do is leave them. And oftentimes what will happen is even if you're leaving them for the late emerging bees, by that time, a lot of the new growth will come up and have covered the woody stems anyway. So I don't think it's making that much of a mess. Now, since I've thoroughly confused you on that, let's go into looking at the leaves. During the past several years, there's been starting to see signs like this in people's yards and campaigns and things on the internet, leave the leaves, because we've known for a long time, but it's just starting to get into our psyches that leaving the leaves is good for all sorts of, for the garden and for the animals that live in the garden. Now, when I went to research what kind of animals live in the leaves and depend on the leaves, it was basically overwhelming. There are so many types that live in the leaves, depend on leaves, prey on things that live in the leaves that I couldn't list them all. So what I've done is I've just taken a couple of different sizes, starting from the smallest to the largest. And these first ones, the one on the upper left-hand corner, at least on my screen it is, so I hope it's on yours, those are rotifers. And these are basically microscopic creatures that live in either water or films of water that coat the leaves. And what happens with them is if the leaves get dry, these rotifers turn into little spores until it gets moist again, and then they come out. And they mostly feed on organic matter, decomposing matter. Sometimes depending, there are many species of rotifers, but a lot of them do feed on the organic matter from the leaves. And the one over on the top right is a tardigrade. I think I pronounced it right, tardigrade, and it's what they call water bears. And these range everything from vegetation eaters to predators. They tend to live in the top layers of the leaves, of the soil, or the leaves, depending on the species. And there are lots of different species. But these are amazing creatures because they're practically invulnerable. They can be frozen for years. They've done this in labs, and then they can be revived. They can withstand high levels of pollutants. In fact, sometimes the presence of a certain species means that you have a lot of pollution in your area. And then another little larger, it's not microscopic, are things like bristletails, which mostly feed on the debris in the litter and also on the dying leaves. So there's a whole below our line of sight group of creatures that depend on this leaf litter. Then we have the bigger things that we can see, and things like woodlice or pill bugs that we often see in the leaves, sow bugs, the things that curl up into the little balls when we uncover them, and also not so cuddly things, at least they're not as cuddly as chickadees and spiders, that either use the leaves for cover. They'll either use bottoms of leaves to spin their cocoons. Some of you may have gone through the leaves and noticed these silky spider cocoons on the bottom of the leaves, or they'll go through the leaves, and they're basically predators of a lot of the animals in the leaves. And then, of course, there are the more cuddly things that are more cuddly than spiders, at least, that we know depend on leaves. And there are specifically three types of caterpillars, three types of butterflies that actually overwinter in the fallen leaves. And they're this is a fritillary. Whoops. And then there's, wrong one. Morning cloak and question mark butterflies. So I don't have pictures of those, but those are the three types that we know live overwinter as adults in the leaves. And then, of course, there are other things like the woolly bear caterpillar that spends a lot of its life curled up using the leaves as shelter, at least its life as a caterpillar. And also luna moths have complete part of their life cycle in the leaves. A lot of them overwinter in the leaves. So the cover of leaf is important to keeping these animals in your landscape. Let me go back for a second. So when I was doing the research, I came across several studies on the effect of leaf litter on animals and soil. And I'm going to highlight a couple of them here because they seem to be more understandable to the generalists among us. And the first one is done by a graduate student for his PhD at the University of Maryland, and his name is Max Berlotta. I hope I pronounced his name right. And he did a video for the Virginia Native Plant Society chapter, the Potomac chapter, called My Year of Living in the Leaves, where he tracked the effect of leaves on the emergence of two types of insects, Lepidoptera, which are basically the caterpillars and moths, and parasitic wasps. So we see here the goals. This is a slide from his presentation, and these are the goals of his study. And he also studied both forest habitat, and he also, I think, had something like 29 yards that he went into, and people gave him permission to set up his study and do the collections of the insects in their yards. There's the entire name. I couldn't think of it then. My Year of Playing in the Leaf Litter, exploring the effects of leaf litter on insect populations. And the way Max set up his experiment was he set up square meter areas with 4 areas. First is a control area that left the leaves where they fall. The second was an area where he raked the leaves out of the area. The third area was an area where he mulched the leaves with a lawnmower, which is a practice that many of us have to do with our lawns and in our gardens. And another practice, he raked the leaves into small piles. I think he said they were usually less than 10 inches high, which means they don't even go up to most people's knees. And this is wrong. I said he collected the data March 10th to June 2022, but it was actually in 2020. And I think the pandemic affected some of his studies because he wasn't able to gain access to some of the areas, but he seems to think that the data still is valid, at least when he came up with his good preliminary data. And the results that he came up with were a little interesting to me. First of all, there didn't seem to be much difference between the control area and the small piles in the emergence of the Lepidoptera. They seemed to emerge at the same rates, at least at a rate that wasn't statistically significant. And I'm not a researcher, so I couldn't tell you what that is, but it seemed to satisfy him, and it was his PhD. So what did happen was that in the raked areas and the mulched areas, the rate of resurgence of the moths and butterflies emergence went down. And you can see how much higher the area, the decrease was in the area that were mulched with lawnmowers. It was in like over 60%, as opposed to the just raked areas, which was in the 40% range. So gives us this is why it was interesting to me, because it gives us an indication that, well, maybe we're not doing everything right. And to tell you the truth, this was when I went out to some of my Audubon home clients who were very concerned about leaving leaves in the appearance, this is actually one of the things that I did, and maybe other ambassadors too, tell them that, oh, you can mulch the leaves and put them in piles, because that was what we knew at the time. And it turns out this may not be the thing to do. And also was interesting in that he could find no significant difference in any of the areas in the parasitoid wasp emergence. And he's not sure why that is. They do have a different life cycle in that they don't actually build their nests in the leaf or in the ground. But what they do is they lay their eggs in larvae and other types of creatures that nest in the ground. So even though they're not directly dependent on the leaves, their food is, and the food for their young are dependent on those leaves. No, okay. Thought it was I seemed to be missing a slide. But he also did a experiment in yards. And one of the things that he found out in yards is that people, I don't have the slide here, somehow it's missing. Practices that most people rake their leaves in certain areas, like they'll rake their leaves, or they'll get to take their leaves out of their front yards and they put them into the beds or put them into their backyards. And then there are areas that they don't rake the leaves at all, such as their beds and maybe parts of their backyards. And what he found out was that in areas where leaves have been raked or removed by other means for years, they had very low emergence of Lepidoptera on the same scales at the forest, depending on the type of environment it was in. But if you would leave those same areas with leaf cover for 1 year, the recovery was significant. So just leaving your leaves for a single year in areas that you've removed them for years could have a good effect on the emergence of butterflies and moths. And then I looked at another study from a research associate, Abby Yancey, at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and she looked at the amount how leaf litter affected wildflowers. Wildflowers, especially the early emergent wildflowers, have a lot of different cues on when they emerge, soil temperature, light, things like that. But she was specifically wanted to find out how leaf litter regulates the soil temperature and moisture, and seeing how the wildflower responded. And she set up something looked a lot like Matt's Faludas, where she did these meter square states. It's a little hard to see in this picture here. And she set up control areas where there were no leaves, where there were a control area where there were leaves that have fallen. She raked out the leaves in some areas. And I'm not quite sure why she netted the leaves in the other areas, but it's not, I don't think that's important to this study. But what she found out when she collected her data in early March is that by the time she collected her data, many of the wildflowers had already started their above ground life cycles and were hiding under the leaf litter, at least in the plots where she kept the litter, and also on the plots where there was no litter. But on the freezing days that they had there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the top layer of soil and the plants that had grown there tended to freeze, while in the litter plots, the same layer of soil was moist, wet, and the plants seemed unaffected by the frost. So that's evidence that there is leaves do provide some protection for emerging wildflowers. And then one additional thing that she found was that the trout lily, which is what she used in her plots, trout lilies, frequently grew among sycamore leaves, more so than other leaves. But this is something that she's not sure of, so she's going to study that some more. So, but I think right here is another indicator that leaving the leaves is both helpful to the life of insects and of plant life in our gardens. So I've titled this long-term leaf management, but it really is long-term, I guess you might call it litter management, because it also includes the dead flower stalks, which will eventually fall to the ground, decay too. And these are points that I distilled from all the studies that I've looked at, and these studies ranged from northern China to Australia to Pittsburgh to Wisconsin to the Netherlands and England. So I traveled the world right in front of my computer for these studies. The first thing is to plant a variety of shrubs and wildflowers, because the greater the variety of those, the more types of nesting sites you have for the different bees with different requirements. And using natural features such as the dead stalks ensure that the emergent insects won't have to travel far for their food, for their new flowers. So if you leave a patch of monarda, if you cut some dead stalks of monarda in a patch of monarda that you are growing, the bees that emerge from those monarda stalks will find new growing monarda that they could gather their pollen and nectar from right near them. They won't have to fly long, as long as they're the bees that use monarda. So, but keeping the food source next to the nesting source seems to be a very important consideration, especially in the early spring, when we have these fluctuations of temperature, where the bees will be expending a lot of energy, and because the nights become cold and warm, and they won't have to fly far to find their food. Stem seems to be mostly to be used for nesting sites, although some people have observed spiders overwintering in them. And in my own garden, when I was examining a stalk of Joe pieweed, I noticed that it was full of sunflower seeds that a chickadee or a titmouse had cached from the nearby feeders. So turns out that these birds can also use the bigger stalks for caching their food. What to do with the leaves? The best case is to leave the leaves where you can. There's no good time to remove the leaf litter, at least according to Max Ferlita's studies, because insects, mostly moths, emerge as late as June, and that's only what he studied. He only studied till June, so he can't talk about, what emerges later on. Now, if you can't leave leaves in certain places, for example, you have to get them off your lawn, or you have HOA concerns or things like that, the next best thing is to leave leaves in small piles in garden beds or in other areas. And again, he looked at leaf piles that were no higher than 10 inches. Now, I have seen other studies where there are larger leaf piles, and some of those studies have indicated that larger leaf piles might inhibit both the growth of plants and the emergence of insects, probably because of things like keeping the soil too wet or keeping the soil too warm, or not having any light, keeping light from reaching the soil. So there seems to be a point in which piling the leaves is counterproductive, but there's been no research yet on what that counterproductive part actually is. In continuously disturbed spaces, if you leave the leaf litter for even 1 year, you can revive those spaces because of these studies that Max did. And the worst thing to do, it turns out, is mulching leaves with your mower. It had the most negative effects on insect emergence. There could be many factors for that. It could be that you're chopping up the leaves too fine to be an effective thermal blanket or to keep the moisture in. And it could also be you're just chopping up the insects. And other research that I've seen has shown that nesting bumblebees, even though the bumblebees don't nest in the leaf litter or in stalks, that they nest in the ground, any near surface or subsurface disturbance of the ground, including mowing or removing the litter, is likely to be disastrous for the bumblebee colonies. And I think that is from some studies that the Xerces Society did. It includes the mowing and leaf removal. So it's best, if you can, to keep leaves where you can. And if you have to move them in the best way, which is either raking. I'm not sure of leaf blowing. There have been no studies on using leaf blowers. I know one of the problems with leaf blowers is that they blast out air at tremendous speeds, sometimes as much as 200 miles an hour. So I don't know what kind of effect that might have on. One of the things that I also looked into was leaving, let me see what time it is. One of the things, leaving dead wood. And this is not just the twigs and things like that, but actual like logs, stumps, things like that. Now where I live, I live in a wooded area, and every couple of years a tree comes down and one has to be taken down. One's taken down by a storm. And I end up cutting a lot of these tree trunks into logs, and I'll have the tree company leave them for me to use in other parts of the garden. But I looked at several studies that the effect of the leaving this wood, and it seems to be, let me get this. that leaving dead wood in the garden is advantageous in a number of ways. If you can leave logs or lengths of cut tree trunks and things like that in your garden, it also serves as a nesting place for things like salamanders. It also hosts it also is a major source of mycorrhizae, some studies have found out, and also hosts a lot of different types of fungus, mushrooms, like the two that I've shown here, which are actually pictures from my yard on the logs that I left. And the importance of these is that these fungi are often food for other larger creatures. I don't know specifically what eats fungi. That wasn't part of my research, but apparently other research has shown that this is a very important source of food for other types of animals. And they also provide what might be called shelter or food sites for other animals. For example, on the left side, you see one of the logs that I left to mark a garden path. After about 3 years, the pileated woodpecker found out that this was a great source of insects. And I would say that within a couple of days, several visits a day had reduced that stump, which I put in the ground, to a pile of sawdust and wood chips. And also I found, again, this is on my property, the box turtle. I found a box turtle nest taking shelter under about a 4-foot length of log from a fallen oak that I had left there. So there's definite effects to larger animals, advantages of larger animals, but it also turns out that leaving leaf litter, leaving the logs is a major source of humus and organic matter that help maintain the soil structure and provide moisture and seed beds for different types of plants. Now, it turns out that the larger wood doesn't release the nutrients as fast as the smaller things like twigs and that do, but they do so over time. And they're a good long-term solution to the garden, to helping the garden. And in a natural forest, that's how they're part of the cycle. They're part of the long-term solution as opposed to the smaller stuff that decays faster. And they found out that these, just to go on, I don't have pictures, but they found out the Penn State Extension Service has found out that logs and larger pieces of wood house redback and tiny salamanders, 4-toed long-tailed salamanders, greater and lesser gray tree frogs. A lot of turtles bask on logs. I've already mentioned the box turtle burrowing underneath logs. Northern fence lizards use log piles and the five-line skinks, which a lot of us see in our backyard, also shelter under wood. And we also know that eastern garter snakes and worm snakes hibernate under rotting wood. I've several times turned over pieces of wood in my yard and found those. And also a little bit on the downside, one time I did find copperheads nesting in a wood pile, but this was a larger wood pile, one that I kept far from my house. And I don't think they're going to nest in like 1 or 2 logs, pieces of wood piling on top of one another. So now let me get into, I'm almost done here. It's 1:45. I want to leave some time for questions. Let me get into how you might manage this in your yard. One of the first things that I came across was something called the soft landing. And I'm not sure if she's the first one to do it, but Heather Holmes sort of popularized this in some of her writings. And this is planting under your trees with different types of species of wildflowers that can live in the shade of the tree. And usually those trees, they're usually dry, shaded sites because the trees, a lot of the trees, especially beech, take the moisture out. But by putting these plantings under the trees, you provide habitat for a lot of the different types of insects that live part of their lives in the trees. And also the leaves shed under the tree canopy provide food for the tree and shelter for the other plants around it. And this could also, I think I have a picture of it. Yeah, here it is right here. And this is also a way to make leaving your leaves maybe more palatable. I mean, you can see on the lower edge of this picture, there are dead leaves in there. And of course, when all this dies back, except for maybe the carrots, you'll have a bunch of dead leaves. But this shows you, and it shows people that, you're gardening. This is a purpose. Here is a bed around trees, and this is where the leaves belong. The leaves fall from the trees. They cover the drip line. And, what I actually have going here is a garden and not a mess. Something else you can do, and Thomas Church, who I didn't really want him aligned, but people may have thought I was big on something. Let's see if I have it. No, he called curbs. He was big on organizing his gardens using curbs, a lot of hardscape. And here are different types of curbs that you can use to sort of show that, yes, you're organizing your garden. This one on the left is just stone, I think quartz, that people in the neighborhood had gathered and put around their beds. And as you can see, to the left is the neighbor's house, with which they have raked up all the leaves all the way to the curb. And these are 1 acre lots, so that's a considerable amount of raking and leaf blowing all the way to the curb. And that is leaf litter. And that is, on the right, they've laid down mulch. And you see the other person left plantings and also has leaf litter there. And the one on the right is, this is sort of does double duty in that the logs are providing homes for at least for shelter for things under them, and also define the area of the yard where that's planted with. You can see it's sort of the shrubs there. Although I don't think these logs are going to decay. I think they're actually cut telephone poles, and I think they're going to take a longer time to decay. I don't think he bought those. So if you want to get a little more formal, you can do something like build a wall as the person on the left did. Now, most of these are non-native plants. In fact, I think almost everything in here is a non-native plant. But the reason that I show this is because you can see that in this wall on the left, this built stone wall, there's definitely leaf litter in there, but I don't think anybody's going to come along and say, hey, you better blow away your leaves because, it looks very messy. And this picture is one taken by Nancy Lawson and used at one of, she put in one of her continuing education sites. And this, you can see that, again, she's used rocks to delineate her garden, but she's also done a couple of other things that are useful in showing people that this is a garden. And first of all is the use of structures. You have a bird bath here that shows that, yes, this is a garden. And I mean to do things here. I mean, you can put a bird bath, you can put a sculpture, a statue of St. Francis, you could put, bird houses or something like that. And she also has a margin of lawn, and that's another indication that, this is a kept area and I'm not just, the interesting thing is that I don't know if that's mulch or leaf litter in the picture, so let's say it's leaf litter. And also another thing to do is signage. She's using a sign to show that, that hey, I mean to do this. This is a monarch way station. And to the left is a picture of my garden. This is right at the curb, right at near the road, where I've made sort of a sculpture of these gardens, a standing sculpture of these garden and a rock to sort of define my property, because the area in front of it is all it's not common ground. It's setback for the road and things like that. So it's really not mine, but I garden it anyway, and I leave the leaves there. And also you can barely see, but there are northern sea oats up against those logs. So I put some northern sea oats there because they spread fast. But I want to show that, these aren't things that I've just randomly planted there. And there's my sign too. So I've left the logs, which, as you can see, there's holes in them from the beetles and stuff like that. So I'm providing good habitat. I'm using the logs as sort of like a garden sculpture, and I'm putting a sign there and showing an edge. And also, this is a picture of what's called a loggery. And this is something that I found a lot, mostly in English gardening things, where they will take logs and dead wood and they will actually use them in their garden as sculptures. And you can see here, this is used as a sculpture within the garden to, it actually would help some of these plants grow. It provides the right growing conditions for ferns and other types of moisture-loving flowers. And also it's a piece of art. And also you can see there's insect holes in there. And while I was doing this research, I found the English have this fascination with stag beetles. And they call these things, a lot of them, stag beetle loggeries. So I don't know, I think we have stag beetles around here. So I hope that I've given you what you've come for and not bored you too much with my talks about history and things like that. But I have tried to address a lot of the concerns. I know a lot of you may be in HOAs and have a lot more restrictions on your property than I do. I live in an HOA too, but because it's a rural forested area, zoned agricultural, they're mostly concerned about not cutting down trees and not like worrying about leaf litter or not having lawn and things like that. So that is basically the end of my talk, and I'll open it to questions if anybody has them.
There's a couple of questions in the chat box. You may have answered them. The first one is back to, it looks like there's a typo. Is there a problem with airflow leading to mold?
Okay, this is something that I specifically looked at because that is one of the things that we used to always hear. When I was at George Washington University, I took their landscape design course, and you would always say, "Oh, you have to take the leaves out because it harbors disease." And what the studies found is that it depends. If your leaf litter and your litter is too much, it might cause mold, but they didn't find, and it might cause diseases. But in situations that approximate how the leaf litter would fall naturally, in other words, not in these huge piles, but if you look at a forest, what's the leaf litter? Maybe 3 or 4 inches deep. It didn't harbor the leaves. It didn't harbor a lot of the diseases that people say these leaves cause. And in fact, having the leaf litter actually prevented them because you're maintaining the life cycles of a lot of the things that predate on these diseases. Some of the little things that I showed you. So, and I think a lot of the concern about diseases and things like that were among like flowers that didn't actually want to go there. Like I know that there was a lot of concern on roses and things like that they would get diseases, but these are these need a lot of care anyway. And also Monarda, that's a lot of people say, well, I get Monarda I get what is it on the Monarda? I get fungus on the Monarda. But what I think there is that you're having problems because it's not actually planted in the right place. When I go out on wildflower walks and I see Monarda where they occur naturally there, I see very little of that. I think what's happened is maybe they're in a place with a little too much shade, so a little too much moisture, and you're trying to push the limits, which is fine. You're a gardener, but those are the types of things you're going to get. So I don't think that, at least the research seems to say that's not a problem, at least not for native plant gardens. If you're doing something else, that may be a problem.
Okay, there's two more questions. How thick in inches should you let the leaves remain?
Max Verluto did 10 inches in his study, and he said there seemed to be no negative effects. I also saw studies on done in China, of all places, on the effect of erosion, of leaf litter on erosion. And interesting thing is that they seem to find that up to a certain level, the leaves inhibit erosion, but when the leaves get really high, it actually causes erosion, and they don't know why. So my answer would be, all we can talk about authoritatively is maybe 10 inches, like below your knee, mid-thigh or something like that. But again, something that you might find in the forest.
And then the second part of that is, what is the impact of mulching over the top of leaves?
You know, that's interesting, because I have told clients in Audubon at Home to do that too, when they were saying, well, you know, my neighbors are going to complain about the leaves. And I specifically looked for that, and I found no studies on it. I would imagine that if you keep the layers low, like maybe just enough to cover the leaf and not like 2 or 3 inches deep, and let the leaves do the work, and also depending on the type of mulch you use, that it shouldn't have a bad effect. But I can't really speak to that because I've seen no experiments, because it may, and it also might depend what type of litter you use, whether it repels water, whether it will soak water in, things like that. So unfortunately, I can't definitively answer that question, but it is something that I've told people to do. And I guess it's better than nothing, as long as I know if you have to do it that way, maybe it's better. I don't know. Better than raking leaves.
That's all the questions we have. There was a comment that they like how you called the spiders and caterpillars cuddly. And we do have stag beetles in this area here too. So are there any other questions? I don't see any. Do you have a question? You can unmute and ask it. Otherwise, I think we're done.
Right on time.
Okay.
We really appreciate you coming out and doing this for us. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Our next presentation is going to be in February. And for the life of me, I can't think of what it is, although I should know that.
I think it's crepe myrtle.
That's right. It's about crepe myrtle, pruning, and other tree problems you find in late winter. So again, thank you very much for coming. Tom, thank you. It was a great presentation, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
It was great.
Take care.
Thank you.